Lichens aren't really like any other form of life. They're not really a plant. They contain a fungus, but they're not a fungus per se. They're not an animal. They're not a protozoa. They're kind of their own thing. Although usually if you have to put them into a kingdom, they usually go into the fungal kingdom because they have their structure determined by a fungus. But they're actually several organisms living together in symbiosis. So it isn't a single organism. It's a small group of organisms, and we call it by a single name, lichen. So I've written that for you here in the first sentence. Lichens are made of a fungi that is living symbiotically with an algae and or a cyanobacteria. And as some scientists just found out recently, it can also be two types of fungi. There can be another something in the fungal kingdom also contributing. We have some variability. But most commonly, it's a fungus and a green algae. And as you probably already know, lichens can live all over the world. Here's a picture of Antarctica. And we have some bright red and orange lichens living on the rocks. So even in areas where nothing else can live, lichens can usually survive. And they also have a great ability to survive periods of bad weather, very, very dry or very cold. They can just go dormant. On the bottom of the page, we're going to look at different types of lichen, and I'm going to recommend that you download this page, and we're going to look at all the different shapes and colors down here. But first, we're going to take a look at the microscopic view, really look at its anatomy close up. I'll start out by showing you a picture that's going to be a lot more complicated than what we're going to draw. This is the cross-section of a type of lichen that's kind of looks a little bit leafy. And we've got some definite layers here. We're going to make our layers much more simple. It comes in layers. There's also some lichens that are long and stringy, like say this one here. And so those strings would look like this. It would be like if you take this cross section and wrap it in a circle. We're not going to draw this. We're just going to draw a simple version of this, assuming that our lichen has kind of like a crustier leaf-like structure. Now you'll notice that I have already written the names of the layers here. That's mostly because they're going to have to be very small. It's going to be hard to get them all in here, and I figured that if I just printed them very neatly, that would get them in. So the main structure of the lichen is going to be the fungus. And if you've studied fungi before, you'll know that they're made up of hyphae. There's these long strings, cells that are joined end to end, like this, long cells. You don't have to draw this. I'll just demo it real quickly, like this, and maybe they go off like that. And the cells would have a nucleus. They're actual cells, like this. So it ends up looking like a bunch of strings. So that's what we're going to draw. We're going to draw just a bunch of stringies. Right here where it says upper cortex, there's a layer right here. We're just going to make a bunch of fungal hyphae, kind of like this. A big tangled mat of stringy things, fungal strings. And this is the upper cortex, hard outer layer. And cortex is one of those words you meet all the time in biology. It's probably the most overused word in biology. You see it in botany, you see it in anatomy, you see it just about everywhere. And it just kind of means like tough outer thing, like the bark layer of a tree. You know, the bark is often called the cortex. So we got this tough protective layer. And then why don't we go ahead, see the lower cortex down here? Why don't we kind of make a stringy protective layer here. This reminds me of the upper and lower epidermis layers in a leaf. It's got very similar protective layers, but they don't look anything like this. They're kind of made of rows of plant cells. Okay, but here we have all these. So remember, if we looked at one of these lines, it would actually look like a string of cells, right? But we're just drawing it as lines. Okay, so let's go back up here. The upper cortex has some of these hyphae coming down like this. And this is going to be the layer where we find the organisms that are living with the fungus. And let's just do a kind of normal lichen, nothing too tricky here. Before we put all the strings in, let's put some green algae cells. They're just kind of like little round green peas. Kind of look like green peas. So any color green will be fine. Doesn't have to be exact shade that I'm using. And like I said, it's usually an algae, but it could also be a cyanobacteria. Actually, let me show you a picture if you're not familiar with cyanobacteria. Here's some types of cyanobacteria. So these are bacteria that do photosynthesis, like a plant cell, like an algae cell. A lot of times, these are ones that are not in a lichen. Okay, when they're not in a lichen, a lot of times they line up. Here's some individual cells down here, but a lot of times they make long strings. So this long string here, if you looked at it up close, it would look like little circles, like a pearl necklace or something. You can see here on this one, it's made up of lots of little cells in here, little lines. Here you can see some joining areas. So it often forms, oh, there's some that are individuals. Okay, so there's different kinds, but when you see it here, it would probably look more like this. And I couldn't find an illustration that actually showed you these things living in here, so I don't know. We might just add some other kind of dots and we know what they are. Oh, and then when you see cyanobacteria in a pond, now this is not under a microscope, this is a photograph of a pond. A lot of times the cyanobacteria is partly what goes to form what we call pond scum. Can also be green algae. Now what's the difference between algae and cyanobacteria? Why do they call it a bacteria? Well, it has to do with some of the inner cell parts. When they look very carefully at the cell, a bacteria is a prokaryotic cell and it doesn't have a true nucleus. So if the little cell has an actual true nucleus, they'll call it an algae. And if it doesn't, they'll maybe call it a cyanobacteria. There may be some other little variations inside the cell. But here we're assuming we're dealing with an algae. So we want to take these little hyphae things and kind of wrap them in and around these algae cells. And they actually touch. The hyphae go, they wrap around. It's like it's hugging them, wrapping around. We'll draw close up in a minute. And you could put more of these in if you want to. You can also, if you'd like to, you can put in a different, this is a diagram, so you don't have to worry too much about different colors. You know, you could put in blue for the, maybe this one actually does have some cyanobacteria. And they used to call cyanobacteria blue-green algae. Back when I was a kid, it was called blue-green algae. And then they looked very carefully at the cells and were like, you know, that's maybe not really a true nucleus there. Maybe we better call it a bacteria. So they kind of made this new category. Anyways, these hyphae come down, wrap around here, make this little network. Don't have to spend too much time here with making them all perfectly wrap around those, just kind of approximate. Okay, And so this is what they call the photobiont layer. The biont is whatever little cell is there. Of course, photo means light, and biont, these are the members of the symbiosis that are doing photosynthesis. So these are these cells, the layer that has the cells that need the light for photosynthesis, whatever those cells may be. And here it's green algae. Okay, so that's your photobiont layer. It's a neighborhood, really. It's a neighborhood for algae cells. Okay, and then we have the medulla. It's another very common word in biology. You'll see everything's got a medulla. Everything in anatomy, biology, everything's got a medulla, it seems like. Bones, organs, everything. Okay, so this is a nice open space. It's much less crowded. So we just put some of these hyphae strings going like that. So it's good that it's open because it lets air circulate. So these little algae cells, they're doing photosynthesis. That's why they're green. We'll see that in a minute. We'll draw the chloroplast. So they need water and they need air. Mostly in the air, what do they need for photosynthesis? If you've ever studied photosynthesis, you may know that they really need the carbon dioxide. The things that we think is a waste gas, which we breathe out, and people call it this terrible greenhouse gas, toxic. No, plants need it. This is what they use for photosynthesis. So they actually need carbon dioxide. It's not oxygen, it's not nitrogen, it's the carbon dioxide that they really need. So they need access to air with CO2 in it, and then it's kind of like a real open sponge. So, and I also need moisture. This cortex layer would soak up some water. It would stay nice and wet, so their neighborhood is nice and damp because they need some water too. Okay, so down here on the lower cortex, there's one more thing we have to put in, and that is these little things called rhizines. So now these are not roots. Anytime that they want to name a structure that looks like it might be a root, but it isn't, they oftentimes use a word that starts with R-H-I-Z, like rhizome, rhizos, rhizophus, words like that. So these are rhizines. So though they may look like roots, they are not. True roots, like in plants, roots absorb water and nutrients, minerals. These do not absorb water and they do not absorb minerals, so we can't call them roots. So we'll call them rhizines. And they would be used to attach to a rock or a tree. You know, how do the lichens cling to the picture I showed you from Antarctica? So how are the lichens clinging to those bare rocks? Well, the rocks have tiny, tiny little cracks, and these little rhizines get in there and they grow into those little cracks and they secure it to the rock. Okay, so these little things are the rhizines. So let's see, one more thing we need to do. See in this space up here, hopefully you are working in pencil and you have an eraser. What we want to do is make a little tear right here. Let's say it's kind of got a tear. Maybe accidental, maybe intentional, maybe the plant can just do this too. Right? Make some ragged edges here, some ragged edges here. Okay. And then it's got some of these pieces here. We've got a little piece of fungus here, a couple little pieces of hypha, and each one of them is holding on to its little algae. So it's like you've got a little algae cell with a little piece of hypha wrapped around. And so these can go out. If it gets torn, little pieces can float out, and then what will happen? Well, we've got an algae cell which can divide in half. These are the type of organism that can split. They have options when it comes to reproduction. They can do sexual reproduction and make spores, or they can do asexual reproduction and just simply split in half. First there's 1, then there's 2, then there's 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. So each one of these little pieces here that's floating off, little tiny section of fungal hyphae and its little algae, that can go land somewhere, and then just these few cells are capable of growing into an entire new lichen. So that would be the asexual reproduction. Now, we're not going to draw a reproductive structure here, but it could, some of them, there's a lot of variety, so we're just not going to go there. We're just going to suffice to say right here, there's a note. Note, the fungus is also capable of producing spores for sexual reproduction. And if you really want to get into more detail about that, you can go research that and find out. That's getting pretty deep into lichenology. So let's see, over here, let's do a close-up. Find out what's going on between the algal cell and the hyphae. So maybe you want to circle one over here, one of these guys, one of these, and you can kind of make a line over like this. So we know that this is a close-up of that green circle right there. Now, the circle that I've drawn is the plasma membrane of the algae cell. We need to add a cell wall, kind of like this, a little bit lightly here because we're going to erase little sections of it. But an algae has, like all cells, a plasma membrane. So after you have this drawn, let's put an arrow pointing to that inner circle and write plasma membrane. And if you've studied cells at all, you know that a plasma membrane is very thin, very, very thin and soft. And it's made of little things. They're actually not circles, but we represent them as circles. This is just actually a group of atoms. And then they have little things that look like tails hanging down. You don't have to draw this. I'm just demonstrating here. So that's how small these things are. This line is actually a string of atoms. So this is very tiny. So this membrane is very, very thin and very soft. And you'll find this membrane around all cells. All cells. Every cell in your body, all the way down to a bacteria, has this plasma membrane. Now, you don't have any cells in your body that have this cell wall. You don't really need this. All your cells have other means of protection. So if you're a plant cell or an algae cell, though, you need to have a thick wall to protect the inside of the cell. So let's label this outer thing we just drew as the cell wall. And cell walls are made of various things. Basically, they're made of carbohydrates, sugars, because strings of sugars can be used as building materials as well as burning it for energy. So here, these little carbohydrates are being used, and it might have other things. There might be little proteins in with it or whatever. It would just depend on what the organism was. Okay, so we have this thick, tough cell wall, and so it's going to keep everything inside. Now, the fungus would like to have some things leak out of the cell, as we'll see in a minute. It's going to have to disrupt the cell wall. But before we draw that, why don't we put some parts inside our little algae cell? Down here, let's make a nucleus. We can label it nucleus, and we could give it some DNA. Here's my shortcut for DNA. I just kind of go like this. I just make some wiggles like that, and that was known as DNA. And it would have some other regular cell parts. If you studied cells, you'll know that you usually have endoplasmic reticulum. I'm just going to put ER. And it would have Golgi bodies, which I always represent as a stack of pancakes. And it would have mitochondria. That's the convention for drawing mitochondria. And it would have some other parts. It would have lysosomes and little vacuoles and other little things. It would have ribosomes, just stuff like that. But up here, more importantly, it would have some kind of structure that does photosynthesis. So we're just going to make couple of these. I'm going to make them green. Now, they may not actually look like this. Different types of algae have different looking cell photosynthesizing parts. So we're just going to say, I don't want it to look like a face. I think I'll make one up here too, right? So make a couple other little things. All right, so these, we'll call them chloroplasts, just like in plant cells. Although sometimes in little individual cells they get called plastids or various things, but we're trying to keep it really simple here. We're just going to say they're chloroplasts. They do photosynthesis. This is the part that's green. Now see here we have them made them as a green dot. The whole cell kind of looks green, but if you were to look at the cell under a microscope, there would only be one part of the cell that's green, and that would be the chloroplast. But then you get so many of these cells together, they all just kind of look green. This might be jammed full of chloroplasts. But if you look, it's only these that are green. The nucleus is not green, mitochondria, so nothing else is green but these things. That's what gives it its color. So these are doing photosynthesis, just like a plant cell, taking the sunlight and the carbon dioxide, water, and turning it into sugars. So we're going to make some dots here for this representing little sugars, basically glucose. It's making little glucose units. You can do a lot of things with glucose. You can burn them for fuel. You can build things with them. Very, very useful. All right, so these are sugars. You can even label it sugars. Okay, so this is where the fungus gets interested. This is making sugars. Now, a fungus cannot make its own food. It's not a plant, and it's a heterotroph. Remember, an autotroph is something self can make its own food. A fungus is a heterotroph. It has to find its food somewhere else. So look, yum yum. It's going to grow one of those hyphae cells down here, and what it's going to do is make a break, kind of make a cut in the cell wall. It disrupts the cell wall, but it's not going to break the plasma membrane. If you put a hole in the plasma membrane of a cell, you kill it. That's really how you kill a cell. You just puncture its plasma membrane. It can't function anymore. It's like popping a balloon practically. The cell wall, though, it can survive with holes in here, and that's what happens. It snuggles in here. We can put another hyphae down here. They come in. So these are the hyphae, or that's a hypha. We can put singular. That's a hypha. That's the hypha in there. Comes in here again. Just make a little break. It goes right in here. Now, does this actually hurt the algae then? No, it's not being killed. It's not having its cell membrane, the plasma membrane ruptured. It's not rupturing the membrane, so it's okay. But this allows things to leak out like sugar. Now, I don't know whether the little sugars, they actually go out like this. My original drawing, I had them going out like this. Leaking out. They may leak out like this. That would be nice for some of the hypha cells that are far away here. They need some. The one that's touching right here, we could just have probably just sugars leaking right across into the cell, because that's how the fungus eats. It just takes things in right through its cell. So these guys could just get nutrition there. Now maybe that's what happens. I don't know how much leaking actually goes way out, but it basically causes the algae cell to leak out its glucose sugars, and the fungus can eat them. So how does the algae feel about this situation? Is it being harmed in any way? No, it's not being harmed, but is it being helped? So if you have a situation where one organism is benefiting greatly and the other doesn't really care one way or the other, it's called commensalism. But when you have a situation where both organisms are benefiting, it's called mutualism. And in a lichen, what we see here is usually called mutualism, so the algae must be benefiting. And in fact, it's benefiting by living in this nice little neighborhood here. It's got a safe place to live. It's got plenty of water and nutrients and protection, this nice hard layer above it. In fact, if you felt sorry for these algae cells and you thought that this was not fair and the fungus was taking advantage of them and you wanted to set them free, and you took them out and you put them somewhere else to grow on their own, they would die. Nothing would happen. And the same thing with a fungus, interestingly. If you take the fungal cells and you try to grow them somewhere else without an algae, it doesn't work. They just sit in a little blob and they don't form this nice structure. They only form the structure when the algae is here, and the algae really only prospers when it's in this environment. So they both benefit. So we could write this down here. Right here we have the fungus does this in the symbiosis. The fungus, number one, most important thing is it provides the structure, that nice neighborhood. And number two, it absorbs water and I'm going to say minerals. You could say nutrients, but basically nutrients means minerals, elements that it needs. And the algae does this. It makes sugars through photosynthesis. And if there's a cyanobacteria there, it can also provide sugars. I'm going to use the word bi because it's short and I've got a little space here. Photosynthesis. And we don't know a whole lot. It might be doing something else, but we just don't know yet. Same thing if there's a second fungus in there. We're kind of not sure exactly how it plays its role, what it does, why it's there. So that's kind of a cutting-edge research right now. And then we're ready to go down and look at morphology. So for this lower section, we're going to look at lichen morphology. This is a really good word to know. You see it all the time in biology. Every type of biology, they'll talk about the morphology of something. So morph means the shape or the form. Ology means the study of. So this is where we describe the form or the shape. Basically, what does it look like? So some of the lichens look like a crust. They're hanging on to a rock or something. So if you download this paper, I give you pictures of crustose, and we've all seen these growing on rocks and trees. We've all seen these. One type of crustose shape is really nice called the sunburst. They grow in these circles. So you'll get a chance to draw a sunburst right here. So your job is to draw some little colored crustose lichens on this rock here and draw a little sunburst right here. Then you're going to draw a couple folios, and I show you one right here. You can just color it or something, but make some little leafy shapes growing on this stick. So make some folios, and then here you're going to want to put on some fruticose, and fruity means bush. So these are the stringy things, like maybe that stringy thing there. And you can make it hanging down also. There's some of them that hang down like that, or you can make it going like this. And then maybe make one of them that looks something like this down here. This is where you get to do something with a tall shape. Look at these. These are called British soldiers because they have a little red hat. I'm not sure what those are called, but you can make some little cute little lichen that grows up like that. So this is the part where you can just work on your own. It's your own pace. Just have this, or you can find your own pictures also. But if you want to use that sheet, you can. So you can just finish that on your own time.